Okay, so they bring the case up in front of Johnson in the Supreme Court, and how do they find?
Yeah, well, the Supreme Court, John Marshall writes the opinion. Johnson is the representative of the land company. McIntosh is a guy they found who was willing to stand as defendant, who had acquired the lands later through a claim purchase from the United States. So the issue was, clearly these land speculators had bought the land earlier than the United States had. They stipulated that they had paid adequate compensation to the tribe for the lands, they were properly defined, they bought from the right Indians and stuff. The only real question from the company's perspective was, were these purchases legal under the Proclamation of 1763, these purchases that were made before the Revolution commenced? And that question is answered by the court. The court says, actually, they were illegal. The argument had been that the Proclamation of 1763 was unconstitutional under the British Constitution, that Parliament could have said you can't buy Indian lands, but the king didn't have that power. And Marshall says, yeah, he did. So that's okay. That. If that were all, we'd never remember this case, because who cares whether the Proclamation of 1763 was constitutional? Under the British Constitution, what the court did in addition to that was to adopt into American law something called the Discovery Rule, or the Discovery Doctrine.
Right.
And that's what's important about Johnson versus McIntosh. What the court said was that there's an additional reason that the company's purchase was invalid. And it's this, that under the court's understanding of international law back in the 17th and 18th centuries, when the English arrived on the coasts of the New World, pursuant to international law as understood and applied by the European colonizing nations, they immediately acquired ownership of all indigenous lands, and while the indigenous peoples retained an occupancy right, a right to occupy those lands.
This is what they call a usufruct right?
Yeah, it's a usufruct right, that's the old Latin legal term.
Okay.
While the indigenous peoples retained an occupancy right, and they could sell the occupancy right, they could only sell it to the same discovering sovereign. Okay. So there are two parts to this discovery doctrine. One is what we call the vesting of title, or the vesting of fee title portion, that the discovering European sovereign, the King of England, when they plant that flag in the soil, instantly they own everything they can see. But in addition...
Extending maybe even a little farther.
A little farther than they can see.
Okay.
But in addition, they acquire the exclusive right to purchase, the right to occupy those lands that they now own from the indigenous peoples who live there. Now, in a later decision, Marshall's going to say, well, that's just a rule that works against other Europeans. But at the time, in Johnson versus McIntosh, the court essentially said that it's a rule that actually works to the disadvantage of the tribes, because these tribes that sold these lands didn't own them at the time, applying this discovery doctrine, that they sold them to these land speculation companies. And even though they did retain an occupancy right, and they could sell that, this is sort of the second part, they could only sell that to the British Crown in 1775. So there's sort of a twofold reason for which these purchases are invalid. There's original sales to these land speculators. Now, that was kind of interesting. It was the death of these land speculators, the United Illinois and Wabash land companies. But it had another immediate application that sort of becomes part of the Indian removal story and the Cherokee Nation cases story. It also has a long-term consequence, which is that even today, because this is still the law, with a handful of exceptions, the 5 tribes in eastern Oklahoma and the Pueblos being the big exceptions, Indian peoples don't own their own lands.
Right.
That discovery doctrine from Johnson versus McIntosh tells us that the United States, as successor in interest to the British crowns, owns the title to Indian lands. The tribes own an occupancy right, a right to occupy those lands. It's actually more than just a right to be there. It includes, according to later Supreme Court case law, ownership of all the subsurface natural resources and the stuff on top of the land, the trees and that sort of thing.
And fish, for instance.
And fish, right? Yeah. Well, Right, but specifically subsurface natural resources and,
Right.
and timber are part of the occupancy right. And they have a right to sell that, but because the Discovery Doctrine is still the law, they can only sell those lands to the United States.
Here's the thing. Listening to you describe it in this way, it sounds like you're describing an enormous legal fiction that Marshall creates more or less out of whole cloth. Is that right? Is he creating international law on his own without input from any sort of existing doctrine over discovery? Certainly without input from indigenous folks.
Yeah, certainly without input from indigenous folks. He cites some sources in his opinion. He cites Vattel, he cites sort of some of the old, Grotius, some of the old 17th century international law scholars. He cites old English charters. What I discovered when I was working on the book, and I should say that I think for a long time it was the conventional belief that Marshall, being John Marshall, must be telling the truth, and this must be the way things had been. When I was working on the book, I discovered, and I'll admit to my great sort of surprise and disappointment, maybe, I don't know, hard to say. I was educated in this tradition too. That in fact the background, the precedent, if you will, the authority for this discovery rule might generously be described as suspect. That he had actually lifted it, the portions of the opinion that justify the finding that this is the rule, these are the consequences of European discovery, from a book that he himself had written years earlier, volume 1 in a multi-volume biography of George Washington, that he wrote without benefit of any primary sources, that he apologized for when it first came out, on the grounds that he hadn't had access to primary sources and he had a full-time job. You know, he was the Chief Justice of the United States.
So he didn't have to do his homework.
Well, he didn't have time to do much homework, so he put this thing out there. To his credit, it is, I think, the first comprehensive colonial history in history of the American colonies, North and South, in mostly North, in English.
Let me clarify for the sake of people who may not have much exposure to the politics of Indian law. What you're saying is that under the doctrine of discovery, American Indian people, even though they own their land, do not own their land.
Yeah, they don't, because they own an occupancy right to their land, but the title to their land is owned by the United States.
Seems like that could cause some problems.
Yeah, well, more candidly elsewhere than here. I mean, that's the rule. This rule has gotten exported throughout the English colonial world. So it's the rule in Canada, it's the rule in Australia. And in those countries, the consequences, I think, are more dire because the U.S. Supreme Court has recognized an occupancy right that's fairly robust because it includes subsurface natural resources and timber. That isn't the case in these other countries.
Okay.
It's just sort of a surface right.
But in any event, it sounds like it's the kind of law that is set up to serve colonizing.
Well, this, in my view, was set up to serve a slightly different purpose. And this story is told in full in the book. If anyone's interested in learning more about it, the story that I came to understand as the sort of the background story for Johnson versus McIntosh it wasn't so much that Marshall was attempting to invent a rule that would facilitate colonial expansion. I think his ends were a lot more modest than that. He had an immediate situation calling out for resolution involving Virginia military veterans from the Revolution who had been promised lands or granted lands in southwestern Virginia as compensation for their military service. Right. Those lands were Chickasaw lands, it turns out, and the Chickasaws weren't interested in sharing. So the Virginians sort of abandoned this attempt to provide these lands as compensation. And then Kentucky became an independent state in 1792. And then the Chickasaws eventually signed a treaty leaving their lands in southwestern Kentucky, at which point Virginia said, great, now our veterans can get have access to them, and the state of Kentucky said, over our dead body. This is Kentucky now. And that dispute was hot and live at the time Johnson versus McIntosh came up. So my understanding of Johnson versus McIntosh is that what Marshall did was what he commonly did, which is to use one case to settle two problems. One was to get rid of the Illinois and Wabash land companies, but the other was to resolve this Virginia military veterans claim. The ground of objection was that these were Indian lands at the time that Virginia purported to grant them. So Virginia had nothing to grant.
Right.
And what the Discovery Doctrine rule says is actually they did, because Virginia, as the successor in interest to the British Crown, owned the underlying title. So what Virginia had to grant was the ownership of the lands. And even though the Chickasaws retained an occupancy right they didn't give up until decades later, that title had passed to these veterans.
Okay.
And so they were entitled to go out now and occupy their lands.
So the question of how to go about passing the right of occupancy comes up for Marshall again in the Cherokee Nation v. Georgia case.
So the vesting of fee title portion from the Johnson versus McIntosh Discovery Rule turns out to be what triggers the circumstances giving rise to Cherokee Nation versus Georgia.
Okay, well, we'll see if we can figure that one out on the next go-round.